recording. So welcome to our last class of December. This is Paul's letter to Philemon. Let's start with any questions, comments, reaction, anything that y'all have had up to this point. Anything we gotta clear up, talk about, bring to light? Other than you're excited you had a little letter. It was a shorty. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. And we'll get going. Okay, today we are in an odd one because it's not a letter to a community. This is different. This is a letter just to an individual. This is our last one for December. When we come back, we'll dive into Galatians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. So we're working our way through them. You can see that this one was written right around 55 to 56. And I'm going to stop sharing for a second and see if, make sure Bernie gets in. So. Bernie, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Bernie? No? Okay, I'm going to record it. Let me send him a message. So I'll send that. Well, that's odd. Okay, so let me go back and share my slides again. Tell you where we're at. So we're in the mid 50s. And we're about halfway through all of Paul's letters. Okay. I'm just going to remind you on our ground rules for Paul. Paul didn't write everything attributed to him. In this letter, there's no question. This is all attributed to him. So there's no belief among scholars that this is a cut and paste job like we've seen in other ones. We're going to trust Paul's words over the words of others about him and trust Paul's actions as evidence of his commitments. And we're going to talk about that one in particular on this one because Paul's actions have been interpreted in a really diverse way for this letter. So I thought this was cute. This is, I looked for memes on Philemon. So now every time I see it, I want to say filet mignon. Okay, here's the overview. It is the shortest of all the letters. It is the only undisputed letter of Paul addressed to an individual. It's written from the perspective that understands friendship in terms of reciprocity. So you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Reciprocity, Paul's going to lay this on heavy in this one. Philemon owes Paul a favor, and Paul is writing to cash that favor in. But here's the twist. Paul's not asking on his behalf. Paul is going to use his privilege of this favor for a slave. Someone who's at the bottom of the social hierarchy who cannot ask for himself. So Paul's going to use his privilege to ask a favor for a slave. Pretty standard overview of how the letter lays out: salutation and blessing, prayer of thanksgiving, and then he's going to go right into this appeal on behalf of his slave Onesimus, who is like a son to Paul. And Paul is going to assure Philemon that he will be obedient to Paul. And then it's going to close with greetings for a bunch of companions. So Paul is in prison when he's writing this, and he's there with several of his co-workers. And Philemon is apparently very wealthy and very influential. We know that because he owns many slaves, and he's able to host gatherings of the church in his home. And he and Paul clearly have a relationship, deep enough that Paul refers to him as a dear friend and a coworker. So this is not a casual acquaintance. You could assume is a deeper relationship. That relationship, though, is one of apostle to disciple. So Paul, in some way, we do not know how, is responsible for Philemon's conversion to Christianity. So thus, Philemon owes Paul his very self, right? So Paul's the one who gets him to become a Christian. Philemon owes Paul his very self, right? So the debt is huge. And Paul assumes that he has authority over Philemon, this person of prestige and wealth, in matters of faith and duty. And he is going to call on that. Okay. Okay, so there's a problem. One of Philemon's slaves, Onesimus, is with Paul, and Paul has come to really depend on him personally and professionally. And I always struggle with this one's name. Onesimus has recently converted. Onesimus has recently converted, most likely through Paul. But there's a background situation where Philemon believes that Onesimus has wronged him in some way that caused him a financial loss, right? So Paul's in prison and the slave Onesimus is with him, and Paul has come to really depend on Onesimus. Onesimus has converted and become a Christian, right? Probably through Paul. But before that happened, Onesimus in some way had wronged Philemon, and that had resulted in a financial loss. Best we can figure out what's going on. So what did Onesimus do? Some scholars think that he ran away from his master and stole or robbed from Philemon. That's one option. The other is that Onesimus mismanaged some financial interest for Philemon in a manner that caused a financial loss. Either way, Onesimus is in big trouble, and big enough that he could be executed as an example to other slaves, right? Again, all happened before he converted to Christianity. There's some big rift, and there's been a financial loss that Philemon has had happened to him as a result of the actions of Onesimus. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about slavery at this point in time in history. So during the time this letter was written, the institution of slavery was deeply, deeply ingrained in Roman society. At the time that this is written, 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire Roman Empire were slaves. So, which is just mind-boggling, right? So how it happened was, as the Roman Empire expanded, they would frequently enslave the resident populations of the areas that they took over. And then once you were a slave, then if you had any children, those children automatically became slaves themselves. So that was one way people got into slavery. They were occupied, and then once you're occupied, all of your children and your children's children would be slaved. Another way is individuals and whole families could be sentenced to slavery for punishments or for debts. So if you foreclosed, if you could not pay your loans, that was grounds for becoming a slave. Again, once you're in slavery, all of your children and your children's children would be enslaved. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. slaves had few, if any, legal rights or autonomy. So the masters could beat, kill at their own discretion. Slaves could not legally marry. Any children were the property of the owner. Roman law required that fugitive slaves be returned to their masters, right? So this is the law Paul is operating under. Paul is obligated to send Onesimus back to Philemon because that is the law. But Roman law also allowed a slave who was on the outs with their master to seek arbitration with a friend of their master's. And the slave was considered under that friend's care until that matter was resolved. So again, you've got this overarching conflict. And Onesimus is with Paul. Paul's going to intercede. And all wrapped around this is this context of slavery in ancient times where all of the power rests with the slave owner. Okay, here's Paul's solution. Onesimus is going to return to Philemon with a letter from Paul that's going to encourage his angry master, Philemon, to treat him way better than he's expecting to be treated. And Paul is going to write this letter on behalf of Onesimus to urge Philemon to welcome him back in a manner benefiting the gospel, right? So he's gonna play the gospel card. And he's gonna ask Philemon to consider Onesimus as he would consider Paul. So to welcome Philemon back as if Paul, the person who was responsible for giving him back his life, converting him to Christianity, walks through the door. That's what Paul's asking. And Paul is going to offer to cover Onesimus's debts. Though, you know, Paul's pretty poor, so he's going to prefer that Philemon write it off since Paul saved his soul, right? So Paul is a little manipulative in this letter. So he's going to play all of the cards to get what he wants, right? Okay, what Paul wants is for Philemon to send Onesimus back to Paul to perhaps help him on his missionary work. So he wants Onesimus to go to Philemon and then Philemon to return him to Paul, clearing the situation, making it all go away, which seems to suggest that Philemon would grant Onesimus his freedom. So that's basically what it's happening. Now, Paul's writing on slavery is going to be a mixed bag. Next month, we're going to read Paul's letter to the Galatians. It'll be the first letter we come back to. And in that one, you're going to see Paul's very, very famous words that you all know. There is no longer slave or free, male or female, blah, blah, blah. For all of you are in Christ Jesus. There's no longer slave or free, right? So he has not written that letter yet. In 1 Corinthians, which you've already seen, he seems to find slavery irrelevant. But you also have to keep in mind that Paul thinks the world's ending, right? He's an apocalyptic preacher. The world's ending soon. Jesus is coming home. It's all going to be taken care of, right? So it's not a big issue for Paul because the world as he knows it is coming to an end and the new world is emerging. There will be later letters that were not written by Paul. Remember, there's only 7 written by Paul. In those later letters that will be attributed to Paul, they will insist that slaves be obedient to their masters. So this is Ephesians, Colossians, 1 Timothy, and Titus. These are the 4 that people, they are frequently cited as the rationale for slavery to be maintained in the United States. Those 4 letters. Again, they're not written by Paul, right? Paul's going to address slavery in this letter, in 1 Corinthians, where he finds it irrelevant because the world's ending, and Galatians, which we'll talk about when we come back. The 4 letters that form the basis for the theological slave holding, the justification for continuation of slavery in the United States is those 4 letters not written by Paul. Okay, so scholars are pretty divided on what they think Paul wants Philemon to do here. Most agree that Paul wants Philemon to regard Onesimus as an equal, right? So just as if Paul were walking in the door, I want you to greet and welcome this slave. Which, when even you think about that, that is just so countercultural. If you put that statement into that Roman context, that is an enormous ask, right? So all of the power resides with Philemon, all of it. And Paul's saying, I want you to give all that power away, and I want you to welcome this individual who is so far down the social hierarchy, and I want you to welcome him as your brother. So this is really, really countercultural, what Paul's asking, and most scholars agree that is the #1 ask. Then they're kind of confused on what else Paul is asking for. Are they asking Philemon to give Onesimus to Paul as a gift, so he would become Paul's slave? Or is he asking them to free Onesimus so that he could return to Paul to spread the gospel? It's not clear in this letter what Paul's asking. So what Paul did not do in the letter, he does not denounce slavery. He does not argue that slavery is wrong for society or for Christians, right? If Paul was going to say, Christians should not own slaves, should not participate in this cultural system where an individual is treated with this type of power hierarchy, this would be the letter to say it, right? It's right here. He does not denounce it. He does not argue that slavery is wrong. He does not take a principled stand against slavery, right? And he does not argue that Philemon has a moral obligation to release not only Onesimus, but all of the other people that he slaved. Paul does not do that in this letter. And this would be the opportunity to do it. Here's what he does do, right? He does return a slave to his owner without prohibiting the continuance of slavery. So he's going to go ahead and return Onesimus to his owner. And he's also going to go out of his way to help one individual slave without commenting on the institution of slavery as a whole. And then this really, really countercultural thing, which is valuing this slave as an equal, a brother. A really, really radical ask. That's what Paul's asking. Okay, so some impacts of this letter. Abolitionists actually used this letter to suggest that Paul was laying the groundwork for the abolition of slavery and implying that such abolition would be a good thing. So this is one of, and part of it is that radical and countercultural welcoming of Onesimus as a brother, as an equal, as if Paul himself were walking in, right? So abolitionists in the mid-1800s did seize on this letter as theological basis for saying that Paul was on the path to abolition. On the other side, though, this letter was the basis of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So it was used as the scriptural justification for requiring anybody who encountered an escaped slave to return that person to slavery. So this law criminalized the act of providing help and sanctuary to escaped slaves. right? So Paul's act of returning Onesimus to slavery justified this position and lawmaking. Paul believed that the thinking was Paul set an example for all to follow, right? So history has treated this letter with a mixed bag. Abolitionists saw something in it that was beneficial in terms of equity. But this letter was used as a theological basis for just a horrific piece of legislation, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Okay, what do biblical scholars think Paul believed about slavery? They think that Paul did not approve of it. And that they think he couched his language in this letter because Philemon is powerful and prominent, and this is a touchy subject. And basically, Paul made a political move to push it as far as he could with this very powerful individual. And here's a really odd historical note that 50 years after the writing of this book, the Ignatius of Antioch writes a letter where he mentions the bishop of the church in Ephesia at the time, who was named Onesimus. Same spelling, same usage, very, very prominent church. That would have made him a very old man. But if he was very young at the time that Paul wrote this letter, scholars think it may be possible that he was in fact freed, did in fact return and work with Paul and go on to become a very well-respected bishop of a very, very large and prominent church. So let me stop there. I've been talking nonstop. Any questions, comments, reactions to the letter?
Was Onesimus a common name at the time? I've never heard of it in any other connection except in the Bible.
It was a slave name, so which fit the narrative of this letter, which is why they think it may have been him. Yeah.
So at the time that the Bible was being put together in its pretty much current form, could it have been all the additional letters that are not attributed to Paul, or that they don't think that he wrote? Could it have been used to strengthen slavery in the Roman world by coming up with all these things that were against slavery and perpetuating it and so forth?
I don't think so, because I don't think they had the power at the time that they were written. So those letters are written when Christianity is still pretty small, so 100 to 150, say, or maybe 75 to 125. So still small.
But it was later that the Bible, as we know, was put together.
Yeah.
So it could have had different.
Yes, that's a good point. My guess is they were probably written in the same way probably First Timothy is, which has some of the real misogynistic against women, which is telling people how to get along in Roman society in terms of not drawing attention to yourself, which is, follow the rules. And then in later years, and we've seen this throughout history, it's been reinterpreted to meet different political agendas. So yes, absolutely. And we see that really hitting a peak in our country's history, the justification for slavery. No. Go ahead, Don.
Was the justification for slavery in biblical terms. Did those lawmakers think that was necessary, or was that a rule that people followed, or why is it there? I thought they were secular. I thought we were secular.
So I think that, well, I think I would defer to somebody who may know American history better than me. But I think you see the impact of the church and throughout history in our country, even up until today, right? It's still flowing in. When you look at, say, the abortion in our country, even gun rights, people cite scripture for that one. I forgot where I was going with that. But definitely for the Fugitive Slave Act, I think that was an economic question. People, the slave owners wanted those slaves back, and I guess my guess is that they then used scripture to justify those economic actions of oppression. That would be a guess on my end. Yeah.
That sounds like it, economic.
Yeah, so much about slavery and, our Civil War was economic. Yeah. Anybody else? Comments, thoughts, reactions to the letter? Go ahead, Shirley.
Well, my understanding is that some of the current laws, especially that we may see in some of the southern states, about the right to defend. If you think someone may be chasing you or wanting to hurt you, and you can shoot them and kill them, you can do whatever you need, really come out of the same thing, because they were written to justify whatever they might do to a slave.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the same thing, they looked for justification for all these behaviors and laws, and if they could find a way to make it biblical, then so much the better, because they were supposedly such a Christian people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know that that's changed.
Oh, no, I think it's worsened.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think recently it has worsened over, say, 1970.
Yeah. Yep. Go ahead, Liz.
Well, it sounds like Paul was really exerting his authority or his power over Philemon by writing the way that he did. You owe me, so here's what you can do for me, kind of thing, which to me, in that aspect of it, doesn't speak too highly for Paul.
Well, I think you could look at it many ways. One, it's a very manipulative letter. He's pulling all the tricks. You could also look at it as he desperately cares about the well-being of this man, and he's willing to do anything within the framework that he's trapped within the culture he's trapped in. And that means, kissing the butt of the really, really wealthy and influential person, calling in any type of favor he can to see if he can help this guy. And this is one of those things that's just so hard about reading letters. We're only seeing half the story, right? So, yeah. Marilee, are you talking?
It would be nice to know what the answer was.
I know, which is why that odd historical note about this bishop 50 years later is interesting. Yeah. Okay, this is not a rich and deep and intense letter. It's a shorty, which probably is a good way to end December. So when you come back, we're going into Galatians. So whereas Paul might be a little manipulative and a little persuasive in this one, this next letter, imagine an email that's in all caps. Okay, so this is the all caps letter. And it is fiery, and it is the angriest letter that you're going to read. Paul comes out swinging, and but this is also the letter that is going to influence many big theologians. Martin Luther is going to say this is the letter that basically saves his life. So it's a really important letter, but it is fiery, and you just have to imagine Paul writing it with all caps on, okay? So we will not have Bible study again until the 11th. And then I'll also put in another reminder that in February, Maureen is going to teach the Introduction to Process Theology class. And we do have books. If anybody wants to borrow one of the books, they're in the library. So that'll be in February to the first week in March. And then I'll be back and we'll be starting Luke. So we're going to spend at least 1 week, maybe 2, just learning about Luke before we go into the readings. And I'm going to approach Luke just the way I did like Mark and Isaiah, where we'll go through a chunk at a time. And then I'm going to have you watching for a story or a section that really calls to you. And then we'll end with everybody kind of sharing their specific section that really kind of resonated with them, their story. There's some really iconic stuff in Luke that's nowhere else, like the Good Samaritan. So stuff like that. The one that I'm preaching on this Sunday, the angel Gabriel. They don't exist anywhere other than Luke. So that's the plan for the new year. Any questions I can answer from anybody, or I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to let you go early.
Could you, what is this process theology? Just in one sentence, or I'm sorry, I don't know.
Yep. So process theology is a way to think about our relationship with God. Old school theology is God's up here, we're down here. God created the universe and then went on vacation. New thinking around theology is more process theology, which is God creates and God continues to create every minute, every breath. And we are growing into something new and different with God together. So it's co-creation. That's, I think, as concise as I can get it.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, everyone. Well, then I